Hi, everybody. Grab a Bible, open it up to Genesis chapter 5. Genesis 5. As you're turning there, let me tell you what's coming the next 2 Wednesdays. In starting this midweek service, one of the benefits of it is that it's given us the opportunity to do some things that we've wanted to do but can't normally do. So, as you've noticed, because it doesn't happen on Sunday mornings, but it happens on Wednesday nights, the kids are with us for the first part, and then they head out. Next Wednesday is going to be a family worship service where the kids are going to stay with us the whole time. So Scott is going to preach. Good luck for all of that. So we're all going to sing together. We're all going to be together for the entire worship service, and we'll do a few of those a year, and that helps. One, families get to worship together. That typically doesn't get to happen. And what a good thing to help introduce children to what we affectionately call Big Church, is to have them be in here with us and see mom and dad and the faithful believers around worshiping. Then the week after that, 2 Wednesdays from now, for the entire service, we're going to do open Q&A. So the pastors are going to be up here, and we're going to put microphones out there, and you can ask away. Not about anything in general in life. Limit it maybe to Bible stuff, whether it be about Genesis or something else. If you've had those questions about the Bible, we're happy to attempt to answer them. So we'll hang up here for the whole service, and we'll just do that for our time together. And again, we'll do that a few times a year just for the fun of it, because we can. Because we have an environment like this that is set up to do special things like that. So we're looking forward to the next couple of Wednesdays. That'll be a little unique for us, a little special. So I hope you'll be a part of those with us. Have you ever finished a really good book or came to the end of a really good movie only to discover that it ended on a cliffhanger? Don't you hate that? It's the worst. You've followed the storyline, you've gotten engrossed into it, whether you're watching it or reading it, it doesn't matter. And now you don't know what happens next. There might be some resolution to some of the story, but there's an entire arc of the storyline that didn't even touch. There's a character that you don't even know where they landed. You don't know what happened yet. They have all of this setup that they've built you up into and sucked you into, and now you have to wait until the sequel. You have to wait until the next book comes out or something like that. It's incredibly frustrating. When we get to Genesis 5, we're at a bit of a cliffhanger. The first major section of Genesis has just ended at the end of chapter 4. And chapter 5, verse 1 begins a brand new section, and there's some things we don't know as that first section has ended. We've seen God powerfully create all things that exist. It's perfect and good. He creates paradise, the Garden of Eden, places our first parents, Adam and Eve, into that garden to be with them. We've seen the fall and Satan's temptation on Adam and Eve, and sin coming into the world, and the curse that happens upon the earth and upon all of creation because of it, the punishment of death that comes because of the presence of sin in the world. And we see one arc of the story begin to flesh itself out. We looked at that last Wednesday, the line of Cain. Cain rises up and kills his brother Abel. They're the only 2 sons of Adam and Eve. And there's been this promise of a seed to come. Well, Abel's dead and Cain's been rejected by God. Well, now what? We see the culmination of the ungodly line of Cain in a man named Lamech, who's now bragging about murdering those who don't even deserve it. And all of that has happened, and we saw all of that. But what about the other arc of the storyline? What about Seth, the next child? What about this seed that God promised in chapter 3, verse 15, that there's one who will come who's going to undo all that's just happened? He's going to undo what Satan has done. He's going to undo the consequences of sin. He's going to save. What about what's happening there? We can't leave this on a cliffhanger. And the Bible addresses these very quickly in the form of everyone's favorite genre of literature, a genealogy. You're welcome. You like it when we preach through books of the Bible? This is what you get. Chapter 5, I'm going to read the whole chapter so we can get the feel of it all together. Chapter 5, verse 1. This is the book of the generations of Adam. In the day when God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. He created them male and female, and he blessed them and named them man in the day when they were created. When Adam had lived 130 years, he became the father of a son in his own likeness, according to his image, and named him Seth. Then the days of Adam after he became the father of Seth were 800 years, and he became the father of other sons and daughters. So all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. And Seth lived 105 years, became the father of Enosh. And Seth lived 807 years after he became the father of Enosh. He had other sons and daughters. So all the days of Seth were 912 years, and he died. And Enosh lived 90 years, became the father of Kenan. Then Enosh lived 850 years after he became the father of Kenan, and he became the father of other sons and daughters. So all the days of Enosh were 905 years, and he died. And Kenan lived 70 years, became the father of Mahalalel. Then Kenan lived 840 years after he became the father of Mahalalel, and he became the father of other sons and daughters. So all the days of Kenan were 910 years, and he died. And Mahalalel lived 65 years and became the father of Jared. Then Mahalalel lived 830 years after he became the father of Jared, and he became the father of other sons and daughters. So all the days of Mahalalel were 895 years, and he died. Jared lived 162 years, became the father of Enoch. Then Jared lived 800 years after he became the father of Enoch. He became the father of other sons and daughters. So all the days of Jared were 962 years, and he died. Then Enoch lived 65 years and became the father of Methuselah. Then Enoch walked with God 300 years after he became the father of Methuselah, and he became the father of other sons and daughters. So all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. And Methuselah lived 187 years, became the father of Lamech. Then Methuselah lived 782 years after he became the father of Lamech, and he became the father of other sons and daughters. So all the days of Methuselah were 969 years, and he died. And Lamech lived 182 years and became the father of a son. And he called his name Noah, saying, "This one will give us rest from our work and from the pain of our hands arising from the ground which Yahweh has cursed." Then Lamech lived 595 years after he became the father of Noah. He became the father of other sons and daughters. So all the days of Lamech were 777 years, and he died. And Noah was 500 years old. And Noah became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. But I know you probably already have Genesis 5 memorized, and all of your favorite personal verses come out of Genesis 5. Most people, when they read through the Bible, at best, skim chapters like Genesis 5. It's okay, this is a safe place. We're all sinners. We get it. You skim. You do it again when you get to chapter 10. There's another genealogy. You do the entire book of Numbers that way. That's just how it is. There's a bunch of names that you can't pronounce and a bunch of numbers. So most people, when they read it, they completely skip over it. Scholars do the opposite. Scholars almost study the genealogies too much and give them too much attention and write way more words than they should about someone who we know one sentence about. But there is much richness to be found in passages like this. The clear theme of Genesis 5 is death. 8 times death is explicitly mentioned, and he died. Let's remember that God brought the condemnation of death onto humanity for sin. But Adam and Eve did not die that day. They lived for centuries. And this is a helpful reminder that God is faithful to his promises. When God promises death, death there will be. So under this banner, under this general theme of the condemnation of death over all of these years, what does life look like? Living under the curse of death. How do you live faithfully under a curse like that? Well, we understand this reality. We live under the curse of death. Nothing's changed for us since Genesis chapter 5, with the sole exception of the length of our lives. We don't live 900 years. Much shorter than that. But the fact of the matter is our life ends the same way theirs did, with death. So how do we live under this burden, under this dark cloud of the reality of death? Well, this passage gives us some strategies to do that. Number 1, look back to your reminder. You need to represent God. Before the actual genealogy starts in chapter 5, there's this introduction to it in the first couple of verses. It's a reminder of where everything began. This is the book of the generations of Adam. We talked about this last week. It's Hebrew word toledot. This is the next major section of Genesis that's going to run all the way through chapter 6, verse 8. In the day when God created. It's been a while since we've seen that word. We saw it a lot in chapter 1 and chapter 2. This Hebrew verb bara, only God creates. This verb is only used of God. Only He can make something out of nothing. Humanity can form and forge and make. We cannot create. Only God can do that. So this is a flashback now. This is what happened at creation. God did all of this, and He created humanity in the likeness of God. This is a helpful reminder. It's all the way back to Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 to 28, that God creates Adam, man and woman, declares them male and female, made in the image and the likeness of God. That's their job, to image Him, to be a likeness of Him in the world. Their role on the earth was to represent God and take His image, to take His likeness all over creation, extending His dominion over that creation. That's humanity's job. But then all hell broke loose, and sin entered the picture, and this beautiful creation is broken. Adam and Eve are broken. That image of God in them is fractured. It's not removed completely, but it's fractured. And after all of that has happened, and we find ourselves at chapter 5, after Adam and Eve no longer have innocence, and there's shame, and they're hiding from God. After Cain kills Abel, after Lamech's bragging about murder, after all of this death and devastation, the Bible stops and says, before we move forward, let's remind you of what humanity was actually created for. It wasn't this. Humanity wasn't created to kill one another. Humanity wasn't created to die. Humanity wasn't created to be in fractured relationship with God or with one another. This is God's original purpose. So when we look around at life that we live under this curse of death, it is important that we remind ourselves that this is not how it's supposed to be. The reason that you are discontent with the world is because this is not how it's supposed to be. This is not how God originally designed it to be. God's purposes were very good. He declared creation very good. It's perfect. But sin has ruined it. The deception of sin has ruined it, but God has promised to restore. So in the meantime, between that promise of restoration and the actual restoration, we keep coming back to that original purpose. Why are you here? To represent God in the world. That's why. That's how He's designed you. Whether you're sitting at home, whether you're at church, whether you're at work, at school, in a store, in a restaurant, walking in your neighborhood, your job, your design from your Creator is in that place and in that moment you are to represent Him and all that that would entail. So before we even get into that, if you're going to live faithfully under this curse of death, then look back to this reminder. You're to represent God. Number 2, look around to your responsibility. Walk with God. We've brought this up before, and we'll continue to hit it. Why is the Bible so obsessed with genealogies? For those who've never read the Bible before and they read through it, it's overwhelming. They're everywhere. Why are these things everywhere? Because God promised in chapter 3, verse 15, there's a seed coming. That's why. There's one who will be born who's going to undo this mess. He's going to fix this. He's going to restore all of this. And now these genealogies are in place to track that. Because we believe that God made this promise. He's faithful to it. He's going to meet this need. This deliverer is going to come. We don't know when. We don't know who. But He's coming because God said He's coming. Therefore, we're tracking generation by generation, birth by birth, death by death. Family line by family line, we want to know what God is up to. So as As Genesis 5 does that, the genealogy is laid out in a very clear pattern. And even reading it, you can hear the repetition of the phrases. There's a rhythm to it. He was this old, had a son, lived this many more years, had other sons and daughters, and then he died. And the next one, same pattern, same rhythm and everything to it. And there's this link to the line of Cain in chapter 4. We already looked at a bit of a genealogy, 7 generations listed at the end of chapter 4 from the line of Cain, the sinful line, the wicked line. And when you put the two genealogies side by side, the 7 generations of Cain's line and here 10 generations of the line of Seth, there are some overlaps. There are 2 names that are in both lines. Both lines have an Enoch, and both lines have a Lamech. They are different men. They are very different men. In fact, in chapter 5, specific attention is given, the pattern breaks, reading through chapter 5 at Enoch, and it breaks at Lamech. To purposely distinguish, these guys are not the ones from chapter 4. That's a different kind of Lamech. That's a different kind of Enoch. And then, not only are there the same names in 2 of them, several of them sound very similar to one another. So these lines maybe had some overlap. They interacted some, maybe with one another. One has Irad, the other one has Jared. It's pretty close. One has Mehujael, one has Mahalalel. One has Methushael, the other one has Methuselah. One has Enoch, the other has Enosh. So there's a lot of similarity tracking these names. That's why it's so easy to be confused with them. But as the generations are tracked, God is blessing. He's continuing to reproduce their line. God has condemned them to death. Yet, graciously, mercifully, allows them to live for centuries and produce multiple generations of children and grandchildren, and on and on and on it goes. But that hope is overshadowed by the repetition of death. Like, yes, there's all these generations coming, and every single one of them dies. Because God had promised in chapter 2, verse 17, that the consequence of sin is death. Romans chapter 5, verse 12 lays it out very clear. Through one man, Adam, through death has come, and death has now reigned because all have sinned. And the pattern now gets interrupted. So it walks through this fun little pattern, and it even begins with Adam with some similar language in verse 3. He becomes the father of a son in his own likeness and according to his image. Well, who's Adam created in? Whose likeness? Whose image? He's in the image of God, in the likeness of God. And his son is in his likeness and his image. So that pattern from God is passing on, but it's different. It's not the same image. It's not the same likeness. Because what Adam was before Genesis 3, Adam is not now. What Adam was before the fall, Seth will never be. Only God can create perfect humans. Humans can never do that. Because humans are broken and sinful. And now, from this point on, it's not fully in God's perfect image, it's in ours. That's been distorted and broken by sin. And the pattern continues, and it gets interrupted with Enoch. There in the middle of chapter 5, starting in verse 21, Enoch lives 65 years, becomes the father of Methuselah. So Enoch is the 7th generation from Adam. So you can just count through it. He's number 7. Well, chapter 4, in Cain's line, it only had 7 generations. It culminated with Lamech at the end of chapter 4, as now he's bragging, boasting of his murder, of his criminal activity, of his place of God, that God's not doing it right, I'm going to do whatever I want. This height of wickedness from Cain's line. Now, when you match that with the 7th one in Seth's line, they couldn't be more different. Enoch walks with God. He's not puffing his chest out and bragging that he can do whatever he wants with no consequence. He's not bragging about all the murders he's committed. He's living in the height of worship. In fact, twice it's repeated that Enoch walks with God, emphasizing this close personal relationship with God. Because the last time we heard about walking with God, it was when God was walking in the garden in the cool of the day and Adam and Eve hid from God because of the shame of their sin. Enoch's not hiding. There is no shame. He's walking faithfully with the Lord. So what does it mean to walk with God? Matthew Henry, the famous commentator, put it this way. It means to set him before us and to act as if we were always under his eye. It is to make God's word our rule and his glory our end in all our actions. It's to make it our constant care and endeavor in everything to please God and in no thing to offend him. It's to walk with him. It's to follow him. It's to serve him. It's to obey him. It's to love him. So while the Old Testament is typically caricatured as this burdensome law, this harsh sense of moralism, Enoch shows us that's not true. There's no sense of harshness in Enoch's relationship with God or this burdensome nature. It's a loving, devoted relationship with his God. He loves him and walks with him. This is what we know and understand. Colossians chapter 2, verse 6 instructs us to walk with Christ. And then he's rewarded for it. Verse 24, Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Strange language. It only is used one more time in the entire Bible. In 2 Kings chapter 2, when Elijah the prophet is whisked away on a chariot of fire and does not die. So there are two in the history of the Old Testament who do not experience the consequence of physical death. Elijah the prophet and Enoch, the one who walks with God, which is a helpful truth for us in the middle of this chapter that's overshadowed by death itself. T.J. Cole writes this: the finality of death caused by sin, and so powerfully demonstrated in the genealogy of Genesis, is in fact not so final. Man was not born to die, he was born to live, and that life comes by walking with God. Walking with God is the key to the chains of the curse. Everyone will experience death, except for those who walk with God. They don't experience death. So Enoch's unique in that he does not die. He's also unique. Of all the people listed in Genesis 5, he lives the shortest life, 365 years. Anyone before the flood, he's the shortest, but his son, Methuselah, lives the longest, 969 years, the oldest recorded life in all the Bible. The Bible is not interested in explaining how it is that they lived for so long. It offers no explanation that, hey, Adam lived 930 years, and let me tell you how he did it. Keto. Yeah. There's none of that. There's no secret. There's nothing like that. The Bible does not explain. It simply records the fact that these people lived this long. There are scientific explanations for this. Let's remember that in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve have perfect DNA. It's pure. It's not corrupted. Sin comes into the picture in chapter 3, and now it's corrupted. And today, what takes us out in such an early number of years is we're polluted. We're corrupted. We're far from purity. That was not the case in those early years. So what we're watching is that purity begin to fade. There's also those who would say, depending on how you understand the creation account in Genesis 1 and God separating the waters from the waters, that there is this dome of water around the earth, the firmament, whether that's the atmosphere or literal waters that are going to come down in chapter 6 anyway, in the flood, that would have blocked harmful UV rays and kept people from aging. So there's some scientific understanding and explanation of why this could be, but the Bible simply doesn't explain it and says he lived for 930 years, period. And then it moves on, which means he lived for 930 years. And we just nod and go, okay, cool. That sounds great. Good for him. Now, if you take this genealogy in chapter 5, if you happen to be, a math nerd or, like to spend some time doing stuff like this, if you track these numbers in Genesis 5, and if you take it as an unbroken chain, which there's no reason not to, the Bible doesn't give us any reason to think otherwise, it begins to date everything. So Archbishop James Ussher, who was an Anglican bishop centuries ago, tracked all these numbers, and he is the one who said the earth was created in 4004 BC. So if you've ever heard someone who holds to a view known as young earth or literal creationism, and they'll say, the earth's about 6,000 years old, that's where that comes from. 4004 BC, we've had a couple thousand years since then, it's about 6,000 or so years old. The flood then occurs 1,656 years later. The lifespan of chapter 5 is 1,656 years. So we've gone over 1,600 years in a chapter in the Bible. I think it's hard for us to grasp that and the understanding of how quickly those things occur. So if those numbers are correct, the flood happened in 2348 BC. So you can look at those, you can study those. There are a lot of folks who with much intelligence and research, propose those numbers and others. And while people look at these long lives and go, wow, that's incredible, not a single one cracks 1,000. They're all under it. That Psalm 90 reminds us is just a day in God's eyes. That's nothing. It's not a scientific formula. A day is like 1,000 years. It's just a metaphorical way of saying time is relative to an eternal God. 1,000 years, that's just a day. So yes, they live for centuries, but they are mere mortals. They still die under the condemnation of sin. And again, if you do the math, Methuselah, Enoch's son, the longest living recorded person in the Bible, Methuselah dies in the year of the flood. So he either died before the flood or he died in the flood, one of the two. And, this is my favorite part, if you track all this, Adam's been alive the whole time. He lived 930 years. The first recorded birth after Adam dies is Noah. The founder of humanity, the perfect creation of God, has lived through all of this, and he comes off the scene. It's next man up. It's time for whoever's on deck to step to the plate. Because Adam's no longer here. Who's going to step up and do what it is that God has called him to do? That's going to be Noah. And we'll spend the next number of weeks talking about him. So as we attempt to live faithfully in our world, a world under the curse of death that lives under this shadow, this reality of this, our responsibility is to walk with God. This is what we do. To be devoted to him, to serve him, to love him, to obey him, to worship him, because he's everything. You want to escape death? That's the only way. We walk with God. Number 3, look forward to your rest. Hope in God. Look at verse 28. Lamech lived 182 years, became the father of a son. And he called his name Noah, saying, "This one will give us rest from our work and from the pain of our hands arising from the ground which Yahweh has cursed." Then Lamech lived 595 years after he became the father of Noah, and he became the father of other sons and daughters. So all the days of Lamech were 777 years, and he died. Noah was 500 years old. Noah became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Notice the pattern breaks again. The repetition is now gone when we get to Noah, letting us know, stop, pause, consider here, because everything has changed. So again, this Lamech, the son of Methuselah, is not the Lamech who was bragging in chapter 4 that look at all these people I've killed. I've killed a boy for hitting me. That's not him. Cain's line brags and boasts about their sin. This Lamech in Seth's line sighs in the hope for rest. Life is hard. He looks back on God's curse on the ground. This is what sin has done. Through Adam, as sin comes into humanity, it's broken the earth, and life is hard. Work is hard. Relationships are hard. Getting food is hard. All this is really hard. But there's a promise of one to come. He's going to give us rest. He's going to undo the curse. Maybe it's my son. Remember, they don't know who the seed is. They just know he's coming. I would argue that Eve thinks it's Seth because he's replaced Cain. This is him. He's the line. It wasn't. Seth's dead. But now there's one coming. Perhaps he's the one who's going to give us the rest. Noah sounds like the verb for rest in the verse. So which is why he makes the play, he's going to give us rest. He names him Rest so that he'll give us rest. So we're clued in here at the end of this little storyline that it's continuing. There is no record at the end of this genealogy that Noah dies yet. He does. Spoiler. He does. We'll get to that. And this Noah, who becomes this major figure in biblical history, huge, he will not provide the rest that Lamech hoped for. He will not be that one who will bring rest and undo the curse on the earth. In fact, he will usher in the opposite of rest here in chapter 6. But because of his faithfulness to God, because of Noah's obedience of all of God's commands, because Noah walks with God, like Enoch is described, Noah is described. He walks with God. Because of Noah's faithfulness, the one who will in fact provide rest does eventually come. And he comes from this line. He comes from this family. The one named Rest eventually produces the one who provides the rest. And Jesus in Matthew 11:28 said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy burdened, and I will give you rest. I will undo this. I will fix this. I will restore this." So as life is getting more and more challenging, as history progresses here in Genesis 5, that we are the recipients of now, we look back and we realize life is hard. This is challenging. This is not an easy thing. Relationships are hard, and work is hard, and life is hard, and all the stuff we have to deal with. This is hard stuff. And we're going to see that for them, it gets much worse. As chapter 6 opens, that we'll look at in a couple of weeks. All they could do as life was getting hard was look back at God's promise and then look forward in hope that God's going to deliver on his promise. The strategy is no different for you and for me. Life's hard. This is challenging. We live in a world dominated by sin and death, so what do? Acknowledge the fact that God has made some promises and look forward in hope that he will deliver on all of those promises. And in the meantime, we walk with him because we love him. Let's pray. Father, thank you that there is rest to come. You are greatly at work in the world in ways that we understand and can see, and in ways that we can't understand and see. But we trust you. Because we're walking with you, because we are growing in our knowledge of you, because we know you, We trust you because you're trustworthy. So we're not afraid. This life is hard. There's challenges. For some, there is unspeakable pain and tragedy. But for everyone, there is this dark cloud that forever remains over us of sin and death. But thank you for Jesus, this one who has brought rest, this one who's invited us to come to him, as God, to walk with him, to be in relationship with him, to be loved by him, to be forgiven, have the penalty of sin removed, and to have this promise of eternal life that the curse of death is undone because of the work of Jesus for his people. Oh, we're grateful for eternal rest that is to come. And in the meantime, as we live in a sin-stained, self-polluted world, give us strength to walk with you, to be faithful to you, to be in relationship with you, to trust you, because you've made all these promises, and you have never not been faithful. You have forever been faithful to every promise you've ever made. That is our hope. So thank you that we can look back in the early chapters of Genesis and see these promises and know that you've delivered. We're now 2,000 years on the other side of the fulfillment of Genesis 3:15. What a blessing to be able to see that. So we're grateful for the plan that you've orchestrated throughout history, a plan that when we gather, we celebrate. So we're going to take some bread and a cup of juice, and we're going to remember the sacrifice of Jesus, the work that he has done on our behalf, so that we could have rest, so that we could be in relationship with you and walk with you, so that the curse could be undone. Thank you for Jesus. We remember him now. In his name we pray. Amen.